So last week, Ottawa and Alberta signed an agreement to explore a new pipeline route to the Pacific. And that single move has blown the doors wide open on one of the biggest fights in the country.
BC is pushing back. Coastal First Nations are united in a way we haven't seen in years. And the federal government is trying to stand in the middle of a storm it created.
This isn't just about oil. It's sovereignty, the economy, climate promises, and who actually gets to say yes to projects of this scale.
So today, we're breaking it all down. Why Alberta wants this so badly, why BC is pushing back, why First Nations are drawing a hard line, and what Canada stands to gain or lose, depending on what happens next.
We're also curious where you land on this. Do the economic arguments outweigh the environmental and sovereignty risks? Or does this project cross a line that Canada should not cross? Let us know in the comments because we want to hear from you on this issue.
So to understand why this blew up so fast, you have to look at one fact. The route to the Pacific runs straight into one of the most tightly protected coastlines in the entire country.
For this pipeline to work, Ottawa would have to carve into BC's oil tanker ban, the law that's protected the Great Bear Sea and the Haida Gwaii from big crude tankers since 2019.
Alberta business groups love this idea. Ottawa is calling it a national interest, and BC and coastal nations are saying this project threatens rights, livelihoods, and one of the most important ecosystems on the West Coast.
This isn't a shouting match between oil people and environmental people. It's deeper than that. It's wealth, sovereignty, and who actually has the authority to say yes or no to a mega project in Canada.
And let's just clear something up, though. This wasn't a construction contract. No plans were drawn, no company writing checks. What Carney and Smith signed was an MOU, basically an agreement to explore the idea of a new pipeline to the BC coast.
And here's the first hurdle. The route Alberta wants runs straight into a coastline that's been treated as off-limits for decades. The protections were written into law in 2019, but the idea goes back much farther. This is a region BC and coastal nations have fought to shield for generations because of how fragile it is. And there's a reason why they want to protect it.
It's home to Haida Gwaii, a remote archipelago off the northern BC coast. Home to the Haida Nation and one of the most ecologically sensitive coastlines in Canada.
It's not just pretty scenery. It's salmon, whales, ancient forests, and a culture that's been rooted there for thousands of years. One major spill, it would change that forever.
And that's why the region has been protected from the large crude tankers since the 1970s, long before the official ban came into law in 2019. And that's the heart of this fight.
If a new pipeline ends at the ocean, tankers need to come in. And under current law, they can't. So the moment Ottawa and Alberta announced the MOU, every group with skin in the game understood what it really meant.
And that's why the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, responded immediately with a unanimous vote to reject the deal. No wiggle room, no, we'll consider it. They said the North Coast is not up for grabs.
So if the deal felt like a big win for Alberta, experts who follow this closely all agree on the same thing. That was the easy part. The real fight, it hasn't even started yet.
But to understand the stakes, you have to hear Alberta's side of the story too, because they're not making this push just for the fun of it.
No, here's Alberta's mindset. They spent more than a decade watching Canada lose money because we can't get enough oil to Tidewater. One estimate puts the hit at $49 billion over 15 years, all because Alberta's basically been forced to sell to the US at a discount. From their side of the fence, this pipeline isn't some nice to have.
No, right now Alberta basically has one customer, the USA. And when you only have one buyer, they set the price. Alberta wants this pipeline because it can finally give them options. If you can sell to Asia as well, you're no longer stuck taking whatever Washington offers.
And you know what? They're not wrong that the states have changed this year. Trump's tariffs shook the whole country. We all know that. Alberta sees a pipeline to the Pacific as insurance, a way to get access to Asian buyers so we're not waiting around for Washington to change moods. Add to that the jobs, the royalties, and the sense that Ottawa is finally backing their industry instead of tying up conditions, caps, and court rulings, and you can see why Alberta sees this MOU as a turning point.
But the flip side is just as real, even if Alberta doesn't want to linger on it. because a bigger pipeline means more production, which makes it a lot harder for Canada to hit those emission targets that we want without cutting somewhere else. And everyone remembers the years of legal fights around the Trans Mountain Pipeline. This would be even more complicated.
Not to mention investors aren't blind, right? They saw Guilbeault resign from the Carney cabinet. They saw the AFN vote. They know BC isn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. You can build a pipeline on steel and concrete, but if the politics are unstable, the money dries up really fast. And Carney trying to expand the oil exports while keeping a straight face about climate leadership, well, that's a tough sell internally.
So Alberta sees opportunity and stability, and everyone else sees risk and fallout. That's why this is not a simple for or against issue. It's two completely different versions of what Canada needs right now colliding at full speed.
Now let's flip to BC, because their reaction isn't coming out of nowhere either. People forget this sometimes, but the North Coast isn't just another port you can expand. It's one of the most fragile marine ecosystems in the country. A spill there wouldn't be a headline, it would be a catastrophe that would last for generations.
And that's why the region has a tanker ban in place already. BC didn't just wake up one day and decide oil tankers were bad. It's been a position for 50 years. Coastal communities built their entire food economy around the idea that those waters would stay protected.
And then there's the politics. The same NDP government that once fought the Trans Mountain Pipeline tooth and nail is now supporting expanding it. So times have definitely changed. But even with that shift, the one thing BC isn't budging on is the North Coast. Vancouver, maybe. Kitimat, hard no.
Coastal First Nations are even clearer. They said this pipeline is dead on arrival. Not with conditions, not after more meetings, just no. And they explained why. It's their fishing grounds, their food sources, and their economies that are directly tied to those waters. If there's a spill, their communities pay the price. Not investors, not Ottawa, not Alberta. And here's where the story gets even more complicated. While coastal nations are standing firm, there are First Nations in Alberta and the interior BC who are looking at the numbers and saying, if this is going to happen, we want ownership, real ownership. The head of Alberta's Indigenous Opportunities Corporation has already said a project like this could generate significant, stable revenue for nations that buy in.
And Danielle Smith is out there pitching the possibility of Indigenous communities owning as much as half the pipeline. Billions in long-term revenue. Now, that's just speculation, but it's a reminder that Indigenous perspectives aren't identical across the board. Some nations see opportunity, others see existential risk, and both views deserve to be taken seriously.
So now Ottawa's caught between three realities: coastal nations who won't budge, other nations who want a real say and real equity, and a federal government trying to convince everyone it can rebuild trust after blowing that first impression.
And that's why the recent meeting in Ottawa really matters. First Nations leaders didn't show up to shake hands. They showed up to outline exactly what they expect before anything moves an inch. Meaningful engagement, real co-ownership, environmental protections that don't get watered down, and absolute clarity that the North Coast tanker ban stays in place unless they say otherwise.
But here's the thing. Even with Ottawa trying to reset the conversation, the bigger issue is still on the table. This isn't simply about communication, it's about rights. Real legal rights that don't disappear because a government wants a faster timeline.
Add UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Supreme Court rulings on title, and decades of legal precedent, and you've got something Alberta hasn't had to deal with at this scale before: a united Indigenous front with strong legal standing. The AFN didn't vote unanimously by accident. They're sending Carney a message. If you want a project of this size, you talk to rights holders first, not last.
And honestly, the key tension here is Alberta sees the pipeline as economic common sense. Coastal nations see it as an existential risk, and BC is stuck in the middle trying to protect the coastline while avoiding another decade-long court brawl.
And meanwhile, Ottawa is juggling all three: the economy, the climate file, and its relationship with Indigenous peoples, with a project that could blow up any one of those if it's handled badly.
This pipeline is less a yes or no question and more a collision of priorities that don't fit neatly together.
Economically, Ottawa and Alberta see opportunity. Strategically, they see independence from an unpredictable U.S. president. But politically and legally, the tanker ban and First Nations opposition make this a minefield.
This is why you're about to hear a lot of loud claims from every direction. Someone will say this pipeline is Canada's future. Others will say it's already dead. And the truth is, nobody knows yet. There's also the argument that we keep hearing from the industry. Well, it's 2025, not 1995. Technology has moved on, tankers are double-hulled, GPS navigation is light years ahead of what it was, spill response capacity is stronger. Hey, this isn't the era of Exxon Valdez. It's a new generation of safety standards.
But then here's the flip side. Coastal nations aren't comparing this to 1995. They're comparing it to their actual coastline, one of the roughest, stormiest marine corridors in Canada. Narrow channels, heavy swell, wild winter storms. No matter how good the tech is, you can't engineer away geography. And that's why they don't accept modern safety as a guarantee. One serious spill is all it takes to wipe out salmon, herring, and entire food systems. And those systems, they don't reboot with just an update.
And there's one other big question. Why are we fighting over a pipeline at all? Why not just go all in on clean energy? Canada's already building huge renewables, hydro, wind, nuclear, critical minerals, and they're growing fast. But the hard reality is that clean energy doesn't replace the export dollars that oil brings in. Oil and gas still make up 10% of Canada's economy, and that's a massive share of government revenue.
Clean energy can definitely be lucrative. Hydrogen, batteries, small modular reactors, critical minerals, those sectors are definitely exploding, but they don't bring in hundreds of billions a year right now the way oil does. That shift will happen, but it's not happening fast enough for Alberta's books or Ottawa's budget.
So the real fight isn't oil or clean energy, it's timing. Alberta wants revenue now. Coastal nations want protection forever. Ottawa wants stability. Clean energy might be the long-term answer, but oil still pays the bills today. So after all that, the obvious question is there any way forward? Or is this whole thing destined to get tied up in court for the next decade?
There are paths, but none of them are simple. The first solution is the one everyone's been yelling since day one. Talk to the rights holders before you draw the map.
If Ottawa and Alberta want momentum, they need to start with the nations whose territories and waters this would cross before the next steps at all. If this doesn't happen, the rest of the list doesn't even matter.
Another path is Indigenous co-ownership. If nations decide on their own terms that equity and long-term revenue are in their interest, then that really changes the conversation.
But that only works if coastal nations are genuinely on board. And right now, they're not. So co-ownership can't be used as a workaround. It has to be an invitation, not a pressure tactic.
And then there's BC's argument. If Canada must move more oil, expand what already exists. Upgrades, twinning, port modifications. They're saying that those options cost a fraction of building a brand new northern line. And finally, the bigger solution is the one nobody wants to talk about. Canada needs a real conversation about energy security, about where we get our power, how we export it, and what risks we're willing to accept to do that.
Trump's tariffs shook everyone. Alberta sees independence from the U.S. through oil. Coastal nations see independence through protecting their food sources and waters. BC sees independence through stability and avoiding billion-dollar distractions. Those things aren't enemies. They are competing visions for the exact same country.
And the truth is, there's no version of this where everyone gets everything they want. Someone is going to lose something, whether it be a coastline, revenue, rights, certainty, and everyone has to decide together who pays that price. We can't keep pretending that this will sort itself out, because it just won't. If Canada wants to stay a country that includes Alberta, respects Indigenous nations, and keeps its climate promises, then the real conversation has to start now.
And whatever Canada decides, the choices we make here won't just shape this pipeline. They'll shape how we build anything big in this country for the next generation.
Whew! If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person Canada needs in this conversation. Someone who actually wants to understand the whole picture instead of living off the headlines.
So do us a favor and share this video with someone who's trying to make sense of what's happening. The more Canadians understand the stakes, the better our decisions will be.
And if you want to support the channel, Our Canada Cares merch is live, and every dollar of profit goes straight to charity. It's one small way we can give back while we're all trying to navigate this chaos.
You can also join the A team for bonus content, behind-the-scenes chats, and our weekly deep dives over at Substack. It's where we can really stretch out and talk about the stuff that doesn't always make it into the videos.
And of course, hit subscribe, click that bell so you don't miss the next one, and help this community grow. We're building a space where Canadians actually talk to each other, not at each other.
So thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for caring. And we'll see you in the next one.
Ciao for now.